America, from the ground up, is made possible in part by a grant from the Michigan Humanities Council, an affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Central Michigan University College of Humanities, Social, and Behavioral Sciences. The Kirby Foundation, a family foundation supporting education. And B.K. Bradshaw, author of the Crystal Brave series of young adult novels, encouraging young people to explore archaeology.
For most of us, the history of colonial America is all about places like Boston, Philadelphia, Jamestown, and the British settlement of the eastern seaboard. But the archaeological history of North America tells a different story. Out here on the frontier, the story is as likely to be French and Native American as it is British. It's a story that's recorded in the sites, the cities, and the Native American settlements across the continent. From Quebec to Montreal, from Detroit to Mackinac and St. Louis to New Orleans, I'm Monty Dobson, inviting you to join me as we dig into the archaeological history of colonial America from the ground up. This episode is the story of the Europeans and their relentless pursuit of material wealth colliding head-on with the geopolitical culture of native North America. Because archaeology is the study of material culture, it can add flesh and blood to the bare bones of historical narrative. And that narrative is no more real than here in the spectacular walled city of Quebec. Quebec was founded in 1608 by this guy, Samuel de Champlain, making it one of the earliest European settlements east of the Mississippi River. The French came late to colonial expansion in North America. They came looking for precious metals and an eastward water route to the spice-rich ports of Asia. Instead, what they found was a continent filled with unbelievable natural resources, if they could only find the right market. We didn't invent being fashion-obsessed, and in the royal courts of early modern Europe, if you had any hope of being taken seriously as a fashionista, it was the beaver fur hat or nothing. But it wasn't just fashionable accessories they were after. I mean, why travel halfway around the world and risk life and limb for a new hat? Well, human beings are simple folk, and we often do things for a reason. Some of us are motivated by the quest for glory or to serve king and country. But if there's one thing that's guaranteed to get us all up off of the sofa, it's the promise of a bit of cash. Once you dangle the potential for an easy fortune in front of people, they can get pretty energetic. So what was it that first kept the French interested in North America when they didn't find gold or Asia? Believe it or not, it was a fish supper. Europeans had been exploiting the prosperous cod fisheries for some time. You might say the real monarch of North America was King Cod. A good day's fishing is one thing, and while animal rights activists might cringe at the thought of it, it was the fur trade that kicked the French economic interest in the New World into overdrive. Quebec, along with Montreal, Detroit, Mackinac, and the forts and posts of the interior, became key control points in the fur trade network that developed along the rivers and lakes of the interior. And if the King of France had any hopes of getting more out of his New World investments than a new hat, he was going to have to control those water highways. More than a pile of rocks plunked down next to the St. Lawrence River, Quebec was the key to controlling the rivers and lakes of the continent's interior. 150 miles southwest of Quebec, along the St. Lawrence River, Montreal became the major market for furs collected further inland. Unlike the English settlements in North America, New France was never about exporting a surplus population of Protestant religious zealots, peasants, and prisoners. It was about extending the glory and the influence of the King of France and his most holy ally, the Catholic Church. New France was never about the founding of large cities. Instead, it was focused on connecting up the network of small forts, settlement sites, and military centers on the interior of the continent. And that network was actually tapped into a pre-existing system of trade relationships among the continent's native inhabitants. In practice, this meant that the French were more willing to form alliances and work cooperatively with the Indians than were the British. The French and their Native American allies from the Great Lakes region were forging a new way of life based on trade. I traveled to northern Michigan to talk to Eric Hemingway, the director of repatriation, archives, and records for the Little Traverse Bay bands of Ottawa Indians.
We were known as great traders, and we would get in our birch bark canoes and travel vast distances to carry out our trade. And this trade was conducted before Europeans arrived. The Odawa and the Ojibwe and Potawatomi, which comprised the Anishinaabeg, would go and trade with tribes very far north, like the Cree and northern Ojibwe and northern Ontario. We'd go out to Saskatchewan and trade, and then we'd go, once the Europeans made contact, we'd go all the way out to Montreal and trade. And it benefited everybody who was involved. The Odawa were getting access to more goods that made their lives easier. They were getting, elevated status within their communities. And also it was a political advantage, because if you had access to these goods, and when it came time to go to war, which happened quite a bit right in this area, you had that leverage, that you could get goods, you could transport, these materials to your village, and having access to firearms in the 16 and 1700s was a huge advantage.
Together, the Franco-Indian Alliance moved the wealth of the North American interior out along the inland lakes and waterways to the marketplaces of Europe. It helps to think of the continent's lakes and rivers not as obstacles that have to be crossed, but as super efficient natural highways that help move people and goods around. The Great Lakes region was at the heart of the French fur trade in North America. Even now, it's a center of maritime industry. Today, the Sioux Locks move more than 10,000 ships of cargo back and forth between Lake Superior and Lake Huron, making it one of the busiest maritime industrial zones in the world. Still looking for a water route to Asia, the French pushed westward. But they were looking for more than just riches, and missionaries were almost always at the forefront of that move. The French were the first European settlers in Sault Ste. Marie, establishing a missionary outpost along the newly christened St. Mary's River in the 1660s. There's not much evidence left of those early European settlers. For that matter, there's not much that tells us about the early Native American settlers here either. And that's the story right across the New World, where the rush to modernize and to innovate has led to our erasing vast swaths of our shared collective past. Fortunately, the story isn't all concrete potholes and bad architecture. I heard about a fur trade fort where archaeologists are working with state tourism authorities in order to develop sustainable projects that are open to the public. I headed south along I-75 over the picturesque Mackinac Bridge towards the site of one of the longest-running archaeological investigations in North America. Here at the tip of Michigan's Lower Peninsula is Colonial Fort Michilimackinac. It's a replica of the fur trade era fort built by the French in order to control the movement of people and goods over the Great Lakes. I met up with Dr. Lynn Evans, an archaeologist who has spent most of her career excavating the fort. So then, can you tell me how the fort and its discovery and excavation is related to the building of the bridge, or is it related, or are they completely separate?
They're not very related. They're a little bit related in that tourism was increasing steadily with the advent of the bridge. But basically, what happened is the fort was abandoned in 1781, and the whole tip of the mitt was abandoned. When Mackinac City was platted by speculators in the 1850s, they set the fort area aside as Old Fort Park. Nobody ever forgot where it was. They always knew.
Lynn told me she was excavating a site that was helping archaeologists understand daily life for the fur traders living here at the Colonial Fort.
The site that we're working on right now is part of a row house. It was a 5-unit row house, and we're working on one unit which was lived in by a fur trader. The building was built in the 1730s. It was pretty much reconstructed in the 1760s, and it was demolished in 1781 as part of the move to Fort Mackinac.
So what is it that Alex is working on today in the trench?
This is some kind of a wall or a fence, some kind of linear feature, and you can see the very dark soil that's cutting through the gold sand. The gold sand is the beach that the fort's built on. And so what she's working on right now in those orange spots, that's clay that was packed around some posts. And then the mounds of dirt to the right of that, you probably can't see it from here, but when she's working on it, she can actually see bits of a wood post sticking out of that. And so we dig down around the wood and to better define where that feature was.
How would you describe the construction technology that's being used here?
This was what's known as poteau en terre, which means post in the ground. And so they dig a ditch, they put posts in it, vertical posts, pack it with clay and rocks, and that's the clay you're seeing there now, and then fill it back in.
What kind of artifacts have come out of this excavation that tell us about how people were living here on site?
Well, the most common thing that we find, and this is true throughout the site, are remains of the meals they were eating, especially animal bones. So lots of fish. Everybody ate fish. We haven't done any of the analysis on this house yet, but based on what we found in other houses, we should be able to see that the pattern has been that the French tend to eat more locally available things like rabbit, things like waterfowl, even passenger pigeon. We find passenger pigeon bones here. The British, although they eat these things, are also trying to have a more traditional British diet, domesticated things. They have chickens, they import a lot more salted meat, and so we see this desire to remain British on the frontier. The French are more open to different things, and part of that is because the French here, many of the French men, and the population was way out of whack demographically in terms of men and women. So many of the French men married local native women, and of course those women were familiar with how to prepare all these locally available foods. So you see a very different diet reflected archaeologically.
That's really indicative or reflective of the way that the British and the French are interacting with native peoples across the frontier.
Absolutely. This is just one more facet of that different cultural approach.
Lynn, one of the things I really love about this place is that not only is it a fantastic archaeological site, but it's a tourism attraction that's open to the public, and people get to come in and see the process and talk to the archaeologists. What is the question you get most often?
Well, one of the things that people really want to know is how we know what to keep and what we just throw away. And the simple answer is we keep anything that's not a rock or a root. We're interested in saving the things that were left by humans, the bones from the animals that they were eating, or that were made by humans. A bead, a piece of a dish, a piece of window pane glass. So we save the pieces of the building, the things that people used.
So Lynn, when archaeologists talk about excavation, what do we mean?
Basically, it's controlled digging, and by controlled, the first thing we have to do is know where we are in space, and so we establish a grid. You can see our bright pink strings here. We do hand excavation here, so we use mason's trowels.
We are finishing up the base of our level 2. So that is there's the sod level, which is where we remove all of the sod. And then there's levels 1 through however deep you have to go. And each level, the way we're doing it, is 10 centimeters.
So what is it that Hillary's doing here at the screening table?
Well, this is the next step. Once we have our bucket of dirt, we bring it over, and first we run it through a 1/4-inch screen, and this helps us get the larger rocks out. Pieces of chinking from between the posts we'll save that are found here. And then we put the dirt on the window screen. We've sifted it right onto the window screen. We use water from the hoses to force it through, and then we pick through the tiny little remains. And so if you look here, what she's picking out are fish bones mostly, fish scales.
I can see
Sometimes we find little glass beads, the tiniest little seed beads. We find lead shot. We've been finding pieces of straight pin.
Lynn told me they had uncovered archaeological evidence that tells us how the colonial fort fit into the international trade networks of the 18th century, so we headed over to her lab to find out more.
What kind of things are you excavating here at the colonial fort that tell us about how Mackinac is linked into the broader world?
Well, one of the most common trade goods that we find are these seed beads. These are glass beads, probably made in Italy, possibly in Bohemia, and we find them by the thousands. Another thing that we find that's not quite as common are gun parts. These particular pieces are from French trade guns. The French are much more rococo. You can see the scrolls and the rounded patterns, and the trade guns are much fancier. A French military gun would have these general shapes, but wouldn't have the incredible detail that you see on these.
The types of pottery that you're finding here at Mackinac really is coming in from all over the world. So what do we have that's representative of the things that you found?
We have things coming from as close by as French Canada, like this little cup, as far away as China. We have this little saucer, this is English creamware, and then we have things from Germany. This is a beautiful piece of a stoneware fragment.
The archaeological evidence from Fort Mackinac demonstrates that life in New France was different from the traditional colonial American experience of the East Coast. But I wanted to know if Mackinac was typical of a fort in New France. Steve Brisson is the Deputy Director of Historic Mackinac Parks. Steve has spent a lot of time working out how the colonial fort would have looked in the 18th century. I met up with him to talk about how the buildings there were related to structures elsewhere in New France.
So this is the most recent building on site to be reconstructed. What was it used for originally?
It was a row house, a domestic structure composed of a number of individual units.
Okay, so very much typical of the type of thing we've seen elsewhere at the fort and elsewhere in New France.
Built by the French here in the 1740s originally, but then used throughout the remainder period of the fort's occupation.
In terms of the research process for this building, some of the earlier ones were reconstructed in a year. What was the process like for this building?
Archaeology told us it was a post-on-sill construction, the location of some of the doors and windows as far as the exterior, but that was about it from the ground as far as creating the accurate reconstruction. On the maps, however, of this building, historic maps, a note was made that it had a plank roof. So that one was a great
so you
piece
have
of
a
data.
guideline
We
there.
have a guideline, and again, searching through French Canada, that map says plank roof. What does that actually look like in reality? There were some early illustrations from the early 19th century of planked roof buildings in French Canada that showed us exactly what a building like that would have looked like.
Stephen Lynn told me about the French fort and its role in the fur trade, but I wanted to know more about why they had built it there in the first place. The French often located their trading forts near important native gathering places. I asked Eric Hemingway if the site was an important place for the Anishinaabe.
Well, I'll try to sum it up as best as I can, Monty. For the Anishinaabe, the Straits of Mackinac is very culturally significant for us. We have a large number of burials in this area, out on Mackinac Island, here in Mackinac City, Bois Blanc Island, Round Island. These islands are very significant to us for the number of burials that the Anishinaabe would go and inter their dead. And also it was a very important spot for us economically. We'd have a lot of trade come through here, and it benefited everybody who was involved. And the Odawas had the ability to go into these villages and conduct business. And a lot of times, if you didn't have the authority to go into these villages, you could lose your life because you're infringing on other people's livelihoods, their resources. So the Odawa were transporting goods, but they're also transporting authority, so to speak, for the French to go into these remote communities, which is what the French wanted. They wanted to go deeper into the interior to get access to furs. But they couldn't do that without having the proper guides and permission, basically.
I asked Eric if the French would have been able to effectively manage the trade network without access to native technology.
It would have been impossible. The canoes were light, you could portage them, and it was made of an indigenous material, birch bark. So if you damage your canoe, which happened a lot with the portages, and you got to remember some of these rivers that they're navigating, like the Ottawa River has, it's very dangerous. There's waterfalls, there's a lot of rocks and whatnot, and you're going to beat up your canoe. But you could repair it easily because all of the resources were at your disposal. Birch bark trees were everywhere. Spruce root was everywhere. So these men knew how to make these canoes almost anywhere in the Great Lakes. If there was birch bark, you can make a canoe. And you could go into rivers, and these rivers led to villages where there was other tribes dwelling, and the Odawas had the ability to go into these villages and conduct business.
Quebec, Montreal, Detroit, and Mackinac were all important hubs or nodal points in an international network, but I wanted to learn about those more remote sites Eric was talking about. I traveled 5 hours southwest to the town of Niles, Michigan, to meet up with a couple of colleagues who might be able to help me. Michael Nassini and Joe Brandow are co-directors of the Fort St. Joseph Archaeological Project. They're working to unlock the long-lost secrets of this frontier outpost of New France.
If the colonial fort was an example of French control in the landscape, then further south here in Michigan, along the St. Joe River at Fort St. Joseph, we have an example of a site where the French are living cooperatively with their Native American allies. And it's this relationship that makes the fur trade work throughout North America.
Michael Nassini is an archaeologist who specializes in colonial fur trade.
So Michael, we're on site at Fort St. Joseph, which is a point on the fur trade network in North America. What can you tell me about what was going on here in the 17th century?
Well, this is a place where the French came and they established alliances with native peoples. And one of the ways they were able to solidify those alliances was through the exchange relationships that they had. So at the time, of course, in the fur trade, the furs were wanted to make the fashionable French hats at the time that people throughout Europe were wearing, and beaver was most desirable. And so they were able to acquire these beaver from native peoples, and in exchange for the beaver, they were providing them mostly with cloth, which we find very little of archaeologically, but other materials that we do find archaeologically, including glass beads, iron implements like knives, axes, kettles, just a whole range of goods that were in demand by native peoples.
So at a site like St. Joseph, what kind of trade connections can we see in the archaeology here?
Well, one of the things that's neat is, objects of material culture based on their form, their color, the way they were made, we can actually link them to their points of origin. So we found objects that clearly were made in France, were made in England, were made in Germany, and so on. And so Fort St. Joseph was very much connected through these exchange networks.
How does the archaeology tie us into that network, and what would you be looking for to sort of recognize Fort St. Joseph's role in the fur trade network?
Well, first of all, we see a lot of European practices. The archaeology points to a lot of European practices. So for instance, the buildings that we're seeing were clearly made in the European style. The objects that were used on a daily basis were objects that were brought from Europe and so on. But what we also see on the frontier is an interesting blending of practices between what the French were doing and what natives were doing, and that's particularly intriguing to us. It really points to very close relationships that the French had established with their native allies.
So they're starting to adopt native lifeways and incorporate that into their own social structure.
Exactly, and one of the simplest, for example, would be the types of foods they were eating. We know that people in France had been domesticating plants and animals, relying on them for thousands of years, and yet the animal remains that we find here at Fort St. Joseph are predominantly of wild animals. So we have found a few pig teeth, some cattle bone, and so on, but the vast majority is deer, beaver, porcupine, turkey, swan, goose. They're actually relying on the local bounty here.
Originally founded in the 1680s as a mission, Fort St. Joseph quickly became one of the most important nodal points in the French colonial fur trade network. In fact, by the mid-18th century, it was the third or fourth busiest site in that network.
Joe Brandow is a historian who studies the relationships between Indians and Europeans in the colonial period.
So Joe, what do we know historically about the personal relationships at a place like Fort St. Joseph between Native Americans and Europeans, and how does that work?
It's difficult to piece everything together from the historical record because we don't have very much from the native side. But when you look at the aggregate pile of evidence, the material artifacts that you find in places like this, the written record, we know that there was a certain amount of cooperation at a personal level. The French married Indian women. Indians converted to Catholicism. We have the baptismal records for Fort St. Joseph that indicate this. There's a certain amount of intermarriage and interaction between this post and Michilimackinac at the top end of the lake. And that's all part of a series of forts, Fort St. Joseph, Detroit, Michilimackinac, Ouiatenon, part of the French efforts to control the region.
Both the fort and its hinterland continue to be important right through the French and Indian War. In fact, it is exactly the kind of economic activity at a place like Fort St. Joseph that the British were trying to tear away from the French.
Out here on the frontier of New France, the French and their native allies were building a unique culture that blended European and native influences into something new, the voyageur culture. Archaeology at places like Mackinac and Fort St. Joseph shows us that life in New France depended on maintaining good relationships between the French and their native allies.
What we're seeing here is a difference in approach to empire in North America. The French were marginally more collaborative with the Native Americans, but only because they had to be. However, there's something deeper going on in the difference between the way the British and the French approach empire. The French are living with Native Americans, they're marrying Native Americans, they're adopting Native dress styles. They really are fitting into the culture of North America and creating a new hybrid culture. We see those differences in the archaeology at places like Mackinac, where the British are trying to eat British food. They're importing British porcelain. They're doing everything they can to make life there exactly the way it might have been in London.
Join us next time as we dig into the archaeological history of America's First World War, the French and Indian War. Check out the America from the Ground Up website for crew blogs, behind-the-scenes photographs, and more.
America from the Ground Up is made possible in part by a grant from the Michigan Humanities Council, an affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Central Michigan University College of Humanities, Social, and Behavioral Sciences. The Kirby Foundation, a family foundation supporting education. And B.K. Bradshaw, author of the Crystal Brave series of young adult novels, encouraging young people to explore archaeology.